A rich doctor brought a poor young man home despite his wife's objections. A few days later, the wife burst into tears and screamed. The early morning, mist curled like whispers around the jagged rocks of Port Townsend shoreline waves, lapped against the docked fishing boats, their gentle rhythm broken only by the occasional cry of gulls overhead. The air carried a salty chill, tinged with the faint aroma of seaweed. The town seemed to breathe in silence, its quaint streets still damp from the night's rain. Daniel Brooks sat on the weathered steps of his mother's house, a modest structure nestled at the edge of the town. His gaze fixed on the horizon, his fingers gripping the spine of a journal so tightly that the corners bit into his palms. Sharon Brooks had passed away only weeks before, and the world still felt like it had tilted sideways. She had been the anchor, the voice guiding him toward his aspirations of becoming a healer, like the generations of Brooks before her. The journal in his hands wasn't unfamiliar. It had always been there on her bedside table. Its leather cover, scuffed and worn from years of use. He had never dared to open it before respecting the quiet reverence she held for its contents. But last night, in a moment of desperation and longing, he had turned the key. She had left him in her will, unlocking more than he had bargained for your hands. "Look like they're choking that poor thing," came a voice from the doorway, old Mrs. Henley. Their next door neighbor was leaning on her cane, her expression soft, but tinged with concern that journal's not going to run away boy. Daniel looked up, blinking as if surfacing from a deep pool. Yeah, I guess I'm just figuring things out." Mrs. Henley nodded knowingly and tapped her cane on the porch. "Your mother trusted you with it. Whatever's in there, it's yours to carry now with that." She shuffled back inside, leaving Daniel to the weight of her words alone. Again, he let out a breath. He hadn't realized he was holding. He flipped the journal open to the first page, its faintly yellowed paper emitting the faintest scent of chamomile, a smell that always lingered around his mother. Her handwriting, bold but slanted slightly, filled the page to my son. "Daniel, the Brooks family has always been more than healers. We are caretakers of something older, something sacred. The methods I taught you are just the surface. There is much more hidden in the mountains beyond this town. Only those who understand balance of mind, body, and spirit can unlock it. The key is within you, as it was within me and those before us. I hope, my son, you'll find the strength to walk this path." The words blurred as tears welled in Daniel's eyes. He brushed them away quickly, a mix of anger and resolve burning in his chest. She had always spoken in riddles, always alluding to traditions and secrets, but never explaining. Why now? Why not when she was alive? He scanned the next few pages, his fingers trailing over the diagrams of herbs and sketches of pressure points. There were notes scribbled in the margins, brief observations and instructions, but then, halfway through the journal, the pages changed. The sketches grew intricate, weaving symbols he didn't recognize into diagrams of the human body. The notes became cryptic, hinting at techniques he'd never seen her practice. "What is this?" he whispered aloud. The question wasn't for anyone in particular, but the quiet of the morning seemed to absorb it as if the world itself pondered the answer. The journal fell closed in his lap. He leaned back, staring up at the slate-gray sky, his mind reeled with fragments of memory. His mother hunched over her workbench, the scent of dried lavender and ginseng hanging thick in the air, her hands moving deftly as she muttered something he was never quite able to catch. She had always been a healer first, a mother second, but now he realized she had also been a guardian. Daniel stood abruptly, the etal clutched to his chest. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks obscured by the morning mist. They had always been there, unassuming, but imposing like silent sentinels. For the first time, he felt their pull. The faint whisper of something waiting just beyond reach. He stepped back inside the house, his movements purposeful. Now the place still smelled of her eucalyptus and the faint musk of dried herbs, but it no longer felt like hers alone. It was his now, as was the burden of what she had left behind. Grief pressed against him, heavy and insistent, but so did something else resolve. If this journal held the path to the legacy she had so carefully guarded, he would follow it for her, for himself. For the Brooks name, Daniel exhaled, long and slow, the weight of the journal lighter in his hands. The mount waited. The journey was just beginning. The streets of Port Townsend were alive with murmur. As the townsfolk gathered near the newly opened Murray Clinic, the building stood out against the quaint facades of weathered shops and cafes. Its sleek modern lines, an unapologetic declaration of its owner's wealth and ambition. Glass, doors gleamed under the gray morning light, and the polished brass lie. Lettering above them caught every curious eye. Murray Medical Center. Inside, Dr. David Murray moved with an efficiency that bellied his age. He was in his early 50s, but the streaks of silver in his neatly combed hair only seemed to add to his air of authority, dressed in a sharp suit beneath his white coat. He navigated the pristine halls with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. Yet his sharp gray eyes softened momentarily as he passed the reception desk where his daughter Emily stood, holding a clipboard. Emily. He said, his voice, a mixture of warmth and expectation, house. Everything looking out here? Emily straightened her light brown hair, falling into place as she glanced up at him. Patients are checking in smoothly. I think we're ready. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her fingers curling just slightly around the clipboard's edge. David's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Good. I know this isn't easy for you, but you're doing fine. He offered a small nod of approval before disappearing into the next room. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized. She was holding. She turned her attention back to the bustling waiting area, filled with a mix of locals and out-of-towners, drawn by the promise of cutting-edge medicine. The low hum of conversation surrounded her, but it felt distant like static. In the background, Emily stopped. Slouching came a sharp voice from behind her. She flinched slightly before turning to face Karen Murray, her mother. Karen was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, her dark eyes narrowing as they assessed Emily's posture. You represent this family, act like it. Yes, Mother, Emily replied quietly. Her chin lifting ever so slightly, Karen's gaze softened just barely, but her tone remained firm. Your brother would have carried this responsibility without hesitation. You have his brilliance. You just need to apply yourself more, Emily nodded mechanically, swallowing the retort that burned at the back of her throat. Instead, she looked back at the waiting room, focusing on the mundane details. Stacked magazines, polished tile floors, a child tugging at her mother's sleeve. David's return cut through the tension like a blade. Karen, we're ready for the tour, he announced, gesturing toward the clinic's double doors. His voice was calm but firm, the tone of someone used to diffusing situations without escalating them. Karen straightened her expression, smoothing into a polite mask. Of course, she turned sharply and walked toward the doors, her heels clicking against the tiles. Emily hesitated, her hand tightening around the clipboard again, but David's gentle touch on her shoulder stopped her. You're doing fine, he said, lowering his voice, so only she could hear there was something in his tone, a quiet acknowledgement of her struggles, though he wouldn't say it outright. Emily managed a small smile. Thanks. Dad, the tour commenced with David leading a group of key community members and journalists through the facility. He spoke with measured pride, detailing the advanced diagnostic equipment, the in-house lab, and the patient-first philosophy the clinic would embody. But even as he extolled the clinic's virtues, his gaze occasionally drifted toward Karen, who remained at his side, her polite smile fixed in place. He noticed the way her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. Whenever someone asked a question about their family or mentioned Scott, the name hung unspoken but heavy in the air. It was in the way. Karen's smile grew brittle, and the way Emily's eyes darted to the floor. Whenever he was mentioned, David felt it too. The ache of loss wrapped in the guilt of moving. He turned back, forcing a practiced smile. Of course, he said smoothly, but the unease remained a quiet hum beneath his carefully composed demeanor. Meanwhile, in the quiet of the reception area, Emily sat down for the first time that day, allowing herself a moment to breathe. She glanced out the glass doors and caught sight of Daniel Brooks walking past his figure, framed by the gray sky. He didn't notice her, but for a fleeting moment she envied the freedom in his stride. The weight of expectation settled back onto her shoulders as her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Your brother would have carried this responsibility without hesitation. Emily closed her eyes, wondering what it would feel like to walk without that weight, even for just a moment, forward without him. As the ended, David lingered in the hall watching. As Karen walked ahead, her posture as rigid as her expectations. He couldn't shake the growing unease in his chest. Karen had always been strong, the cornerstone of their family, but Scott's death had changed. Her grief had hardened into something brittle and sharp, and Emily was bearing the brunt of it. David, one of the journalists, called out, breaking his thoughts. Can we get about your vision for the clinic? The town square buzzed, with an energy Daniel hadn't felt in years at the corner bakery. The usual quiet chatter of morning, regulars had turned into a steady hum of speculation. He paused the smell of fresh bread, mingling with the salty breeze from the bay, and listened to the conversation unraveling at the next table. Have you seen that clinic? A woman asked, her voice low but brimming with excitement. I hear it's got machine that can diagnose you in minutes, and that doctor, what's his name? Murray, another, chimed in. They say he's from Seattle, big shot, surgeon or something. Must have made a fortune to set up a place like that. Daniel tilted, his head, pretending to stir his tea as the words washed over him. A wealthy doctor moving to Port Townsend to open a clinic. It was an odd choice. The town had its charms, sure, but it was far from the bustling centers of opportunity. Most professionals sort their even-taking walk-ins. An older man said, leaning forward as if sharing a secret, seems like he's trying to make a real impression. Daniel sipped his tea thoughtfully. His mind already working a state-of-the-art clinic might be the last place he belonged, but curiosity outweighed caution. If this Murray was half as good as the rumors suggested, there might be something worth learning or at least understanding. Finishing his drink, Daniel stood slinging his bag over his shoulder. The clinic wasn't far, and he had time to spare. Let's see what all the fuss is about, he muttered, heading toward the sleek new building that loomed over the town's rustic streets. The afternoon sun filtered through the wide glass windows of the Murray Clinic, its rays catching on the polished surfaces and throwing soft reflections onto the bum. Pale walls inside the reception area buzzed with activity. Patients flipping through magazines, the shuffle of papers at the desk, and the murmur of low conversations blending into an ambient hum. The scent of disinfectant lingered faintly in the air. A reminder of the pristine efficiency that the clinic prided itself on. Daniel Brooks hesitated just inside the entrance, his worn leather bag slung over one shoulder. His gaze swept over the room, lingering on the subtle contrast, the polished veneer of modernity against the rugged simplicity of Port Town's usual charm. He felt out of place in his simple sweater and jeans, but he straightened his shoulders and approached the desk. "Can I help you?" Emily Murray's voice broke through the low hum. She glanced up from the screen, her light brown hair tucked neatly behind her ears. Her expression was polite, but guarded, her eyes flicking over him in quick assessment. Yeah, Daniel said, his voice steady. Despite the curious stares from a few patients, I was hoping to meet Dr. Murray. Emily raised a brow. "Are you a patient?" "No, Daniel," replied, glancing past her toward the hallway. "Beyond I'm a healer Eastern medicine, I heard he just opened the clinic and thought it might be worth introducing myself." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Wait here." Emily disappeared down the hall, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest as Daniel waited. He shifted his weight, the awkwardness of the moment settling over him. A few seats away, a man raised his voice in irritation, cutting through the relative quiet. "I've been waiting for over an hour." The man barked, his face flushed. He was broad-shouldered, his movements agitated as he gestured toward the reception desk. "I don't care how new this place is. If they can't stick to a schedule," Sir Emily began as she returned her voice, calm but firm. "I understand you're frustrated, but we're doing our best. It's not good enough." The man snapped, rising from his chair. "I want to speak to someone who knows what they're doing." Before Emily could respond, Daniel stepped forward, his tone measured but clear. "Excuse me, sir. You seem like someone who values getting the best care possible, right?" The man blinked, caught off guard, of course, while Daniel continued gesturing subtly toward the hallway. "The staff here is working hard to make sure everyone gets the attention they deserve. Rushing that process could mean missing something important, and I don't think you'd want that." The man's posture shifted, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. He grumbled under his breath, but returned to his seat. His early bluster diminished. Emily shot Daniel a surprised glance, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, but another voice cut in. "What exactly is your role here, Mr. Brooks?" Karen Murray's voice carried an edge as she stepped into the room. Her dark eyes pinned Daniel with a sharp gaze that brooked no nonsense. Daniel turned to face her unruffled. "I'm not staff, Mrs. Murray. I'm just someone who values good care like your patient here." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. Her tailored suit was as pristine as the clinic itself, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor as she approached. "We run a professional facility. We don't need unsolicited interventions, especially from strangers." "Understood," Daniel replied, evenly, though his calm demeanor seemed only to irritate her further. "But the gentleman over there was upset, and I thought it was better to help than to let the situation escalate." Karen opened her mouth to retort, but another voice interrupted her. "Karen." "That's enough." David Murray entered the room, his tone firm but not unkind. His gaze flicked from his wife to Daniel, assessing the young man with a flicker of curiosity. "And you are Daniel Brooks," he said. Extending a hand, "I practice Eastern medicine, thought it might be worthwhile to connect. Considering your clinic is the new hub for healthcare in town." David shook his hand, his grip firm, but not overbearing. "Eastern medicine. You say not something we typically see in a place like this." "No, but it has its place," Daniel replied. "Sometimes it complements Western approaches. Sometimes it fills gaps." David's expression shifted slightly, a spark of interest breaking through his professional exterior. "Interesting. Let's talk." As the two disappeared into David's office, Karen stood rooted in place, her knuckles white, against the strap of her handbag. Emily, who had been watching quietly from the desk, stepped closer. "He wasn't trying to cause trouble, Mom," she said softly. He was just helping Karen turn to her daughter, her expression unreadable for a moment before she sighed that remains to be seen in the hallway beyond Daniel, followed David into the office, unaware of the storm he had already begun to stir in the Murray household. The office was a stark contrast to the bustling reception area. The walls were lined with shelves of medical books and certificates, their crisp frames arranged with clinical precision. A single orchid sat on the window, still its fragile bloom, a rare hint of softness in the otherwise austere room. David Murray gestured for Daniel to sit down. "I must say, Daniel," David began pouring 2 glasses of water from a crystal decanter. "You've surprised me. Most people wouldn't step into a situation like that." With such poise, Daniel took the glass with a nod of thanks. "It wasn't much, really. Sometimes people just need someone to listen. That's precisely what makes it significant," David said, leaning back in his chair. His expression was thoughtful. "Measuring. I've seen my share of medical professionals who can diagnose a condition but lack the ability to connect with the person in front of them. You have that in Eastern medicine, though not my specialty, has always intrigued me." Daniel shifted slightly in his seat. Compliments from a man like David carried weight, but they also made him wary. "I appreciate that, Dr. Murray, but I'm not sure where this is going." David smiled faintly. "I think there's potential here for both of us. I've always believed medicine should be comprehensive, a blend of approaches that work for the patient, not against them. I'd like to mentor. You teach you what I know and perhaps learn from you in return." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "You want to mentor me?" "Yes," David said simply, leaning forward, now his tone serious. "I know talent when I see it, Daniel. You have the instincts and dedication with some formal guidance. You could make a real difference." Before Daniel could answer, a sharp voice cut through the open doorway. "David." A word. Karen stood there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was as sharp as the angles of the room. David sighed and stood. "Excuse me, Daniel." The conversation that followed wasn't quiet enough to escape Daniel's ears. "Are you as serious about this?" Karen's voice was low but icy, bringing some stranger into our home. "He's not some stranger," David replied evenly. "He's a promising young man with a unique skill set, and we don't even know if he's trustworthy." Karen snapped. "You think you can just invite anyone into our lives?" After what she stopped abruptly, her voice catching when she spoke again. It was colder. "We don't need someone like him complicating things." David's reply was calm, but firm. "He's staying, Karen. This is my decision." Karen's footsteps retreated sharply. The sound of her heels clicking down the hall moments later, David re-entered the study, his expression carefully neutral. "I won't lie, Daniel. He said it might not be easy for you here, but I believe it'll be worth it." Daniel hesitated, aided his gaze drifting toward the window. The mountains loomed in the distance, shrouded in the evening mist. He thought of his mother's journal, of her words urging him to step forward to find his path. "All right," he said finally, "I'll give it a shot." David extended his hand again, a gesture of agreement. Welcome aboard the Murray residence was as grand and imposing as its clinic counterpart, situated on the town's outskirts. The house was a stark contrast to Port Townsend, rustic charm, all sharp lines and gleaming surfaces. The evening light filtered through floor to ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the minimalist furniture and marble floors. The air inside felt cold, not from the temperature, but from the atmosphere. A precision and order that left no room for warmth. Later that night, as Daniel carried his small bag into the guest room, he caught sight of Emily in the hallway. She hesitated, then offered him a tentative smile. "Long day?" he asked lightly, adjusting the strap of his bag. She nodded. "My mom can be intense," Daniel chuckled, softly sensing The understatement, I'll keep that in mind. Emily glanced at him, her expression more open. Now, for what it's worth, I think it's good you're here, Dad M. He doesn't connect with people easily, but he seems to see something in you. Daniel tilted his head. Her words surprising him, thanks, Emily. That means a lot. She shrugged, her smile growing a little. Don't let her scare you off. I'll try not to, he said, his voice steady but warm as Emily walked away. Daniel stood alone in the quiet hallway, the weight of this new chapter settling over him. The tension was thick, the stakes high, but for the first time in a long while, hope flickered in the corners of his thoughts. The Murray household was eerily silent at dawn. The kind of quiet that spoke not of peace, but of tightly held control. Daniel woke early, the faint scent of coffee drifting through the halls. He wasn't used to such stillness. It pressed on him like an invisible weight. After getting dressed, he made his way to the dining room, where Karen sat, her posture as rigid as the high-backed chair. She occupied you up early, she said, not looking up from her tablet. Her tone was clipped, offering no pretense of warmth. So are you, Daniel replied lightly, pouring himself a glass of water. Her eyes flicked to him, cool and assessing, before returning to the screen. David is too trusting, she said abruptly, her words slicing in through the air like a blade. He sees potential in everyone, but potential doesn't pay off for most people. Don't mistake his kindness for anything more than that. Daniel held her gaze, steady, but not confrontational. I appreciate his trust. I don't plan to let him down. Karen's lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. We'll see. The tension lingered with Daniel as he walked to the clinic later that morning. The bright atmosphere of the reception area did little to ease it, but his focus shifted when David introduced him to a particularly challenging case. A middle-aged man with a long-standing chronic condition that had eluded standard treatments. The man, visibly frustrated, gestured wildly as he spoke. Every doctor tells me the same thing. Manage it with medication, but nothing ever changes. I'm tired of pills, David. Listened patiently, his expression. Calm, Daniel, he said, glancing over. What would your approach be? Daniel hesitated for only a moment, then stepped forward. If you're open to it, he said, addressing the man directly. I'd like to try something different. A blend of techniques that focus on your whole system, not just the symptoms. The man looked skeptical, his arms crossing. And you think that'll work where everything else hasn't? Daniel's tone was steady, respectful. I can't promise a cure, but I can promise to listen and try to help you understand what your body is telling us. It was a gamble, but the man nodded slowly. Over the next hour, Daniel worked alongside David, blending diagnostic tools with gentle Hansen techniques. His mother had taught him by the end of the session. The man's guarded demeanor had softened, a small glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. Thank you, he said gruffly, shaking Daniel's hand before leaving. You're the first person who hasn't made me feel like just another chart. David's approval was subtle, a faint nod, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly, but it was there. Well done, Daniel, he said. You handled that with care and precision that evening. Daniel found himself on the back porch of the Murray home, staring out at the darkening horizon. The weight of the day, both its challenges and victories, settled over him like a heavy blanket. I thought I'd find you out here. Emily's voice broke the silence. She stepped outside, pulling a light cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Daniel glanced over, offering a faint smile needed some air. Emily leaned against the railing beside him. How's it going, the clinic? My dad, my mom, her voice trailed off with a faint laugh, but her tone was serious. It's a lot. Daniel admitted your dad's been great. Your mom. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I think she's protective, understandably so. Emily snorted softly. That's generous. She's controlling, always has been, especially since she paused, her gaze drifting to the distant trees. Since Scott Daniel didn't press, sensing the rawness of her words. Instead, he offered a quiet space for her to continue. She's convinced I have to follow in his footsteps. Emily said, eventually medicine, the clinic, all of it, but it's not what I want. She turned to Daniel, her expression both earnest and uncertain. Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life? Daniel nodded, the memory of his mother's journal flickering in his mind. I think I know what that feels like. But the life you want, it's still yours to choose. Emily studied him for a long moment, then nodded her shoulders, relaxing slightly, thanks. She said softly, for listening, as she turned to head back inside. Daniel remains. At the railing, the distant mountains silhouetted against the twilight sky. The house behind him was still cold, its walls heavy with unspoken tensions, but out here the air felt lighter quietly. He resolved to find his place in this house of secrets. No matter how long it took, the air in the clinic was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of Karen's heels. Against the tiled floor, she stood near the reception desk, observing the flow of patients with the intensity of a general surveying. A battlefield when Daniel entered carrying a folder of notes from the morning's cases. Her eyes narrowed. You're persistent. I'll give you that, she said without preamble. Her tone cutting through the calm like a scalpel. Daniel stopped adjusting the strap of his bag on his shoulder. I'm here to help, Mrs. Murray. That's all. Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. Help or meddle? My husband may be enamored with your little experiments, but I don't trust untrained hands wandering into what should be a professional space. Daniel met her gaze, steady, but not confrontational. I understand your concerns, but maybe there's room for more than one perspective here. Her eyes flicked to his hands, calloused and steady, before she turned sharply room. She muttered, walking away, isn't something we have to spare later that evening. As the golden hues of sunset bathed the Murray household, Karen sat rigidly in the living room, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the armrest of her chair. Daniel found her there, her face unreadable as she stared out the wide glass window. Mrs. Murray, he began tentatively. I was wondering if you'd let me try something. It's a technique. My mother used simple, but it might help with stress. Her gaze snapped to him, sharp and defensive stress. I'm managing just fine. Daniel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I know you are, but grief has a way of lingering, even when we think we've handled it. Her expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something else, something raw beneath the surface. And you think your methods will fix that? Not fix, Daniel said quietly. Just ease it if you're willing. Hearing this part of the story. Don't you feel that being a doctor is such a noble profession? However, always remember to take good care of your health so you can avoid having to meet them. Leave a comment saying pancake. If you're feeling great today. And now, let's get back to the story for a long moment. Karen's face was unreadable then, with a sigh so soft it seemed to escape against her. Well, she nodded, fine, but don't waste. My time. Karen sat stiffly in one of the kitchen chairs, her arms crossed, as Daniel prepared a small tray of warmed herbs and oils. The faint, earthy scent of lavender and sandalwood filled the room, blending with the natural light spilling in through the windows. This won't take long, Daniel said, his tone. Even he moved with deliberate care, explaining each step as he worked. This is about calming the nervous system. Nothing invasive, just a way to let your body reset. She said nothing, her posture rigid as his hands gently pressed against points on her shoulders and neck for the first few minutes. She was silent, her body tense, as if bracing for something unpleasant. Then slowly, her shoulders began to drop and her breathing evened out. This smells like something my mother used," she said suddenly, her voice softer than before. Daniel glanced at her, surprised by the break in her demeanor. "Your mother, Karen?" Didn't answer immediately when Finn spoke. Her words were quiet, as though she hadn't meant to say them aloud. "She used to burn herbs when my brother and I were children, said it kept the house at peace." Daniel didn't push her further, letting the silence settle naturally between them. When he finished, she sat back, her expression unreadable once again. "It's less unpleasant than I expected," she said, her tone neutral. "That's a start," Daniel replied with a small, genuine smile, Sem. To his surprise, she didn't snap back in the days that followed. Daniel noticed subtle changes. Karen still carried herself with her usual precision, but her sharp edges seemed softer. She began sitting in the garden during the late afternoons, her tablet set aside in favor of simply watching the wind move through the flowers one evening. As Daniel brought tea to the patio, Emily joined him, her expression curious. "What did you do to her?" she asked, half teasing but genuinely intrigued. "Just helped her find a moment of calm," Daniel replied. "The rest is up to her." Emily shook her head, her gaze drifting to where Karen sat in the garden, her features relaxed for the first time in years. "I've never seen her like this." "Not since Scott," Daniel offered gently. Emily nodded, her voice quiet. She loved him more than anything, and losing him, I think she lost part of herself too. She's been trying to make me fill that gap ever since. Daniel rested his hands on the tray, his eyes soft with understanding. "You're not him, Emily, and you don't have to be." Emily turned to him, something in her eyes, grateful yet unsure. "It's just complicated." "But thanks," Daniel didn't reply, sensing that was enough for now. As Emily walked back into the house, Daniel glanced again at Karen. She caught his eye for a moment and gave the faintest of nods, a small gesture, but one that felt like a step forward. The single desk lamp in the small study Daniel had claimed in the Murray household cast a dim circle of light over Sharon's journal. Low-hanging clouds obscured the distant mountains outside the window, their silhouettes hinting at undiscovered secrets. Daniel leaned over the journal, his fingers tracing the curves of his mother's handwriting. The scent of old paper and faint lavender filled the room, a reminder of the life she had once lived. He had read these pages dozens of times by now, but tonight something felt different. The words seemed heavier, resonating with a clarity he hadn't noticed before. The connection between mind, body, and nature is not a mystery. One passage read, "It's a cycle. One influences the other endlessly. The secret lies in listening and in understanding how they speak to each other. The mountains hold the key to this balance. Only when you are in harmony with yourself will the path reveal itself." Daniel sat back, his pulse quickening. The mountains, his mother had mentioned them. Often, always, with an air of re-rents. Growing up, he had dismissed her stories as metaphors, lessons wrapped in mysticism. But now, reading her words again, he felt the pull she must have felt, a need to uncover whatever truths she had left behind the following morning. Daniel set out early, the journal tucked safely in his bag. The Murray house was still quiet, save for the faint sounds of Karen moving about the kitchen. He slipped out unnoticed, his boots crunching softly on the gravel driveway as he made his way toward the trail that led into the mountains. The air grew cooler as he ascended, the scent of pine and damp earth grounding him in the present. The town slowly disappeared behind him, replaced by towering trees and the rhythmic sounds of his own breath. He carried no map, only Sharon's journal, and a faint sense of guidance beyond mere chance. Pausing to rest near a clearing, he opened the journal again, this time. A sketch, an intricate pattern of spirals and lines that seemed both organic and deliberate, drew his attention under it. Sharon had written the heart of the mountain beats with the rhythm of life. Seek the clearing where the sun meets the earth. Daniel looked up, his gaze scanning. The landscape sunshine bathed the clearing, the tall grass bending gently in the breeze. It was beautiful, but he felt no closer to understanding what she meant. He closed the journal, frustration creeping in. What was he missing later that evening? Back in the study, Daniel pored over the journal again, his mind replaying the sights and sounds of the mountain. He noticed details he hadn't before. The patterns in the sketches seemed to echo shapes he had seen in the trees and rocks. His mother's notes hinted at a rhythm, a harmony he hadn't yet grasped. The sound of soft footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Emily stood in the doorway, a steaming mug in her hands, tea. She offered, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. She placed the mug on the desk, her eyes flicking to the journal. "You've been at that all day." Daniel nodded, his fingers drumming lightly. On the desk. "There's something in here," he said, more to himself than to her, something she was trying to teach me. Emily pulled out the spare chair sitting across from him. "Your mom sounds intense." She was, Daniel admitted with a faint smile, but not in a negative way. She believed in things, balance, harmony, the connection between people and nature. She wanted to pass that on, but I think she knew I wouldn't understand it until I was ready. Emily studied him for a moment, then leaned back and, "Are you ready?" Daniel exhaled, his gaze dropping to the journal. "I don't know, but I feel like I have to try." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful, the mountains. They were important to her, right? Yeah, Daniel said she wrote about them a lot. She thought they held answers if you knew how to listen. Emily smiled faintly. "Maybe they'll tell you what you need to hear." The next time Daniel returned to the mountains. He moved slower, his steps deliberate. He listened to the crunch of leaves beneath his boots, the rustle of wind through the branches, and the distant calls of birds. He let the rhythm of the mountain guide him, the journal's sketches coming to life in his mind as he followed its subtle clues near midday. He reached a small stream cutting through the forest, kneeling. He sipped the cool water in his hands, its clarity, a reminder of what he was seeking, something pure, untainted. The thought grounded him, and, as he stood, he noticed something ahead. A patch of sunlight breaking through the canopy, illuminating a circle of moss-covered stones. His breath stopped. It wasn't just a clearing. It was the clearing Sharon's words echoed in his mind, where the sun meets the earth. He stepped into the circle, feeling a strange stillness settled over him. For the first time, the journal's mysteries didn't feel insurmountable. They felt like a path. He was finally ready to walk. The storm rolled in, just as Daniel returned to the Murray household. His boots caked in mud from the mountain trails. The wind howled through the eaves, shaking loose leaves from the trees and sending them spalling across the yard. Fat drops of rain began to drum against the windows as he stepped into the foyer. The warmth of the house, a sharp contrast to the chill that clung to his skin. The storm outside had been building all day, and by evening it reached a ferocious crescendo. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the Murray home, each drop a staccato reminder of the chaos brewing within. Thunder rumbled low, rattling the glass like an impatient guest, demanding entry. Daniel sat in the study, the journal open but unreadable under the flickering light of the desk lamp tonight. His focus was not on the words. His thoughts churned with the day's discoveries, the strange serenity of the clearing, and the weight of Sharon's words still echoing in his mind. The storm, it seemed, mirrored his restlessness. A sudden, sharp voice from the living room broke through his lust. Thoughts Karen, he closed the journal and made his way down the hall, drawn by the unist's stable edge of conflict. As he approached, he heard her voice rise again, strained and brittle, like a branch about to snap. Why is he still here, David? Why Karen's silhouette was sharp against the dim glow of the room she paced near the hearth, her movements agitated. You bring him into this house, into this family, and act as if what David's voice was calm. But there was an undertone of wariness. Is he a decent person trying to make a name for himself? Because that's exactly what he is. Karen whirled to face him, her voice cracking under the weight of her frustration. He doesn't belong here. He's not part of this family. He's just a reminder of everything. We've lost the words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment the only sound was the relentless drumming of rain against the windows. Daniel stepped into the room, his presence unannounced but impossible to ignore. Karen's head snapped toward him, her face a mask of anger, but there was something raw beneath it, grief, unspoken and unresolved. "You remind me of Scott," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. "Every time I see you, it's like he's standing there just out of reach. And I can't." She stopped her breath, hitching as she pressed a hand to her chest. "I can't go through that again." Daniel froze, the weight of her words sinking into him. He hadn't expected this, her disdain. Yes, but not the pain that bled through her anger carefully. He stepped forward. "I'm not Scott," he said quietly, his voice steady but soft. "I could never be him, and I'm not trying to take his place." Karen turned away, her shoulders rigid, but he continued. "I know what it's like to lose. Someone who shaped your word world, my mom. She was everything to me. The absence of her left me feeling as though everything had lost its meaning, like I'd never find my footing again." The room was silent, save for the rain and the distant hum of the storm. Slowly, Karen sank into the armchair by the fire, her hands trembling in her lap. "He was my anchor," she whispered more to herself than anyone else. "The one thing that kept everything steady, and losing him changed everything." Daniel said, kneeling slightly to meet her eye level. "I get that, but pushing everyone else away doesn't bring him back. It just leaves you lonelier." Her gaze flicked to him, and for the first time, her eyes softened, the lines of tension in her face eased just barely. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted, her voice breaking. "You don't have to figure it out alone." Daniel said, "You've got David, Emily. Even I can assist if you allow it." Karen looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, the smallest, most tentative gesture, but one that spoke volumes. The storm continued outside, but the atmosphere inside the house began to shift later that night as Daniel prepared to leave the living room. David caught him by the shoulder. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with unspoken gratitude. Daniel nodded. "We're all trying to find our way, right?" David's smile was faint, but genuine. "You have a way of seeing people, Daniel." I think she needed that as Daniel returned to his study. He glanced back at the living room. Karen still sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked smaller, less formidable, as if the storm outside had finally coaxed the one within to quiet. The mountains greeted Daniel the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The storm had washed the air clean, leaving the sky a brilliant blue and the earth damp but vibrant underfoot. He safely tucked Sharon's journal into his bag, its weight serving as a constant reminder of the legacy he carried this time as he followed the trails. His steps were deliberate and his mind focused on the clues. Her words had woven the clearing felt different now. The sunlight filtering through the trees illuminated the moss-covered stones with a golden glow, almost as if inviting him closer. Daniel scanned the area carefully, his eyes catching on something he hadn't noticed before, a faint path winding deeper into the forest. His pulse quickened as he followed the trail, the scent of pine and earth thickening the air. Then he saw it, a small cabin nestled against the base of a rocky outcrop, its wooden walls weathered but sturdy. Sharon's journal had mentioned a place where she practiced her craft, a space untouched by time or distraction. This had to be it. Daniel approached cautiously, his hand brushing the smooth wood of the door before pushing it open. The interior was sparse, but meticulous shelves lined the walls filled with jars of dried herbs, tools, and books, whose espelines were cracked with use. A table stood in the center, its surface covered with handwritten notes and diagrams that mirrored those in the journal. Sharon had disappeared, leaving everything as it was. He exhaled slowly, his fingers trailing over the objects she had once touched here in this quiet sanctuary. He could feel her presence more strongly than ever. Her teachings weren't just in the journal. They were etched into this place, waiting for him to discover them. When Daniel returned to the clinic later that day, his mind was brimming with ideas. The cabin had given him not only tools, but a renewed understanding of the balance his mother had always spoken about. It didn't take long for an opportunity to put it into practice. The patient was a woman in her late 40s, her face drawn with exhaustion. She had been visiting the clinic for months with chronic pain that defied conventional treatment. David had reviewed her case repeatedly, adjusting her medication and recommending physical therapy, but nothing had brought her lasting relief. David expressed her frustration, passing the chart to Daniel. "I've done everything I can think of," Daniel skimmed the notes, his mind racing. "Would you let me try something?" he asked. Meeting David's gaze, "It's not in your textbooks, but it might help." David hesitated, then nodded. "Do what you think is best." Daniel approached the woman, gently explaining his methods in simple, reassuring terms, using techniques rooted in his mother's teachings. He combined precise acupressure with herbal compresses. He had prepared that morning. He moved with care, listening, not just to her words, but to the subtle cues of her body. When the session ended, the woman sat up slowly, her eyes wide. It's the first time in months. I felt like I could breathe without hurting." She said, her voice thick with emotion. David watched from the doorway, his arms crossed, a thoughtful expression on his face. When the patient left, he turned to Daniel. "I don't know exactly what you did, but that was remarkable." "It wasn't just me," Daniel said, brushing off the praise. "It was a combination of everything I've learned from her case, from you, and from my mother's work." David smiled faintly, but there was pride in his eyes. "You have something special, Daniel. And I don't just mean your techniques. You see the whole person, not just the problem." That's rare that evening. As the clinic emptied and the quiet of the night settled in, David pulled Daniel aside. They stood in the small break room. The hum of the refrigerator, the only sound between them. "I've been thinking," David began, his tone measured. "You've shown more dedication and skill than most people twice your age. You deserve the chance to formalize this. Take what you know and build on it." Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I want to fund your education," David said plainly. "Medical school certifications, whatever you need, you've already proven. You have the potential now. Let's make it official." Daniel blinked, the weight of the offer hitting him. I don't know what to say. "Yes," David replied with a small smile. "You've earned it." Later that night, Daniel sat in the study, Sharon's journal open before him. The pages that had once seemed daunting now felt like a guide, each word imbued with a purpose. As he was finally beginning to understand the cabin, the patient and David's support were all guiding him towards a specific destination. For the first time, Daniel felt like he wasn't just walking in his mother's footsteps. He was carving his own path, one that honored her legacy while forging something new. And as he glanced at the mountains through the window, he knew this was only the beginning. The Murray household hummed with quiet excitement. The dining room table was adorned with bouquets of wild flowers, their vibrant colors, a cheerful contrast to the stormy skies earlier in the week. The faint smell of roasted vegetables and fresh bread wafted through the air, mingling with the sound of soft laughter from the adjacent room. Emily's high school graduation ceremony had been earlier. That day now, the family and a few close friends had gathered to celebrate her achievements. She stood near the kitchen laughing with a friend, her face alight with a joy that had been absent for far too long. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, a glass of water in hand, watching the scene unfold. "She looks happy," David said, stepping beside him. He too wore a rare smile, his shoulders relaxed. "It's been a long time since I've seen her this free," Daniel nodded. "She deserves it. She's worked hard." David's smile faltered, slightly, his gaze shifting to Karen, who stood at the far end of the room. She was speaking with one of Emily's teachers, her posture more at ease than usual. And Karen David asked quietly, his voice laced with tentative hope. Daniel followed his gaze. "She's trying, that counts for a lot." As the evening unfolded, Karen approached Daniel while he stood on the back porch enjoying a moment of quiet. The twilight air was cool but refreshing, the distant mountains outlined against a fading pink sky. "Daniel," she began, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. She hesitated, then gestured toward the garden where Emily's laughter rang out. "She told me tonight about her plans." Daniel tilted his head. "Plans?" "She wants to study social work." Karen said, her expression unreadable. "She doesn't want to go into medicine. She's finally admitted it." Daniel leaned against the railing, his gaze steady on her. "And how do you feel about that?" For a long moment, Karen didn't answer. Then she let out a breath, as though releasing something she'd held for too long. "I thought it would hurt more." She admitted letting go of everything I wanted for her, but seeing her happy, maybe it doesn't matter what I want. Maybe it's time I start listening to what she wants. Daniel smiled faintly. "I think that's the first step and maybe the hardest." Karen nodded, her eyes distant as she watched Emily move through the room inside. "You've been good for this family," she said quietly, "for her, for all of us." Daniel's smile widened slightly, but he didn't respond, sensing the moment needed no reply. As the celebration wound down, Emily gathered everyone in the living room. She stood in the center holding a small stack of papers, her acceptance letter to the University of New York's social work program. "I just wanted to say thank you," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "to all of you for supporting me, even when I wasn't sure what I wanted. And to Mom," she turned to Karen, her voice softening. "Thank you for letting me figure this out. I know it hasn't been easy, but I'll make you proud in my own way." Karen, sitting beside David, blinked rapidly as though fighting tears. She reached for Emily's hand and squeezed it. "You already have." The room erupted in applause, but the moment belonged to mother and daughter. A quiet acknowledgement of how far they had come. Later that night, as Daniel packed the last of his belongings into his bag, Emily knocked on the open door of his room. She leaned against the frame, her arms crossed, her usual teasing smirk in place. "Leaving already?" she asked. Daniel chuckled. "University starts in a week. If I don't leave now, I'll miss the chance to settle in before classes start." Emily's smirk softened into a genuine smile. "You're going to be amazing." "You know that, right? Only if I survive the workload," Daniel replied, but there was warmth in his tone. "Thanks, Emily, for everything." She hesitated, then stepped forward and hugged him briefly. "You'll come back? Won't you, for the holidays or something?" Daniel nodded. "Of course, I've got family here." Emily pulled back, her smile lingering good as Daniel walked toward the driveway, his bag slung over one shoulder. David and Karen stood by the front door. David clapped him on the back, his expression full of pride. "You're going to do great things, Daniel. I have no doubt about it." Karen gave him a rare, soft smile. Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Daniel nodded his chest, tightening with emotion he couldn't quite express. "Take care of each other," he said, his voice steady, "and don't forget to breathe every now." And then the family waved as he drove away, the glow of their porch light shrinking in his rearview mirror as the road stretched ahead of him. The mountains fading into the horizon, Daniel felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. His path was only just beginning, but he carried with him the lessons, the connections, and the love that had grown in the Murray household. The future awaited, and for the first time, Daniel was ready to face it. The Murr household, once a cold expanse of polished floors and silence, was alive with warmth and laughter. The dining room table was laden with dishes, a celebratory feast in honor of Emily's return from New York and Daniel's arrival. The walls seemed to hum with a familiar joy, the kind that spoke of bonds, mended and futures bright. Daniel now, a doctor with years of experience under his belt, stood near the fireplace watching the scene unfold. His posture was relaxed, his sharp suit a testament to how far he'd come. Emily bustled about the room, a whirlwind of energy, her voice animated as she recounted a story from her latest outreach project. And he actually said, "I can't believe anyone cares this much about a stranger." Emily laughed, shaking her head. I told him, "That's my job. Helping people isn't about knowing them. It's about believing they deserve a chance." Her cheeks flushed with pride as she looked around the table. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Karen, seated beside David, smiled softly. The lines of tension that had once etched her face were softer, now replaced by a quiet confidence. She reached for Emily's hand, her voice steady. "You've always had it in you. We just needed to let you find it your way." Daniel gently tapped his glass, attracting the attention of the room as they cleared the dinner plates and refilled the glasses. He stood, holding a small folder in his hand. The conversation died down, replaced by curious glass, an S, and a few teasing remarks. "What's this?" David asked, his brow lifting. Daniel grinned. "I've been working on something for a while now, something that wouldn't exist without this family." He opened the folder, revealing a sleek logo and an official-looking document. "I'm opening a wellness center." He announced the Murray Wellness Center. It'll blend Eastern and Western practices, combining everything I've learned from my mother's teachings and my time here. The room erupted in applause, but David's face reflected more than pride. It was a deep, quiet gratitude. "You're naming it after us?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel nodded. "You believed in me when I didn't even know what I was capable of. This is my way of honoring." That Karen dabbed at her eyes, her voice softer than anyone had expected. "You've given us more than we ever gave you." Daniel smiled, his gaze moving to Emily. "That's not true. You all showed me what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. And I wouldn't trade that for anything." As the evening wore on, the group moved to the living room where the fire crackled warmly. Emily pulled Daniel aside, her eyes bright with excitement. "Can I come visit the center when it opens?" she asked, half joking. "Maybe I'll bring my team from the shelter." "Always," Daniel replied. "You might even teach me a thing or two about social work." She laughed. Deal nearby, Karen watched them with a mixture of pride and peace. David leaned closer, his voice quiet. "It's nice, isn't it, seeing them like this?" Karen nodded, her lips curving into a rare smile. "It is. It's comforting to know that we've finally found our way." David's hand rested on hers, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together. As the night came to a close, the family gathered for a photo by the fireplace, The camera captured a moment that conveyed a powerful message. Emily beaming, with the confidence of someone who had found her calling. David standing tall, with the quiet pride of a mentor. Fulfilled Karen, her hand resting on Daniel's shoulder, her expression softer than it had ever been, and Daniel surrounded by the people who had become his family. His eyes reflecting the journey that had brought them here. The laughter and chatter continued late into the night, but it wasn't chaotic or overwhelming. It was the sound of a family united, not by blood, but by understanding growth and the healing they had given each other as Daniel prepared to leave for the night. Emily walked him to the door. "You know," she said, her voice, teasing, "we're going to miss you next week." Daniel chuckled. "I'll only be a call away. And besides," he added, "I expect all of you at the grand opening." "We wouldn't miss it for the world," Emily said, pulling him into a hug, driving away from the house. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror at the glow of the porch light shrinking in the distance 6 years ago. He had only brought his mother's journal and a burdened heart to the Parthe the Murray home. Now he was leaving with a purpose that felt larger than himself. A purpose rooted in connection, resilience, and the unshakable belief that healing was more than physical. The road stretched ahead, wide and full of possibility, and as he drove, Daniel felt the weight of Sharon's legacy blend seamlessly with his own. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a story that had taken years to build a story. He was finally ready to tell. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community together. We'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss. The Incredible Stories is coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.